Hello, everyone. Welcome to our monthly InfoSec Seminar organized by the Information System Security and Assurance Management Department in Mahalshan School of Management. Today, we are pleased to have five distinguished speakers: Aaron Ferguson, Neal, Alice Kramer-McNish, Alex Mabbott, and Tolulope Mabo, to give us an interesting talk about cybersecurity challenges within the airline industry. Thank you for being with us today and sharing your experience, and thank you all for attending the seminar. And I will let the speakers introduce themselves and start their interesting talk. One final note, for those who are attending without Concordia email addresses, please register at this link to receive your attendance certificate. I will share it with you in the chat area. So please go ahead.
All right, thank you. Hi, everybody. I want to thank you for coming to this session. I was very excited for the opportunity to share with you how we at WestJet run our cybersecurity department and hopefully give you, for those of you who are still students, some insight into how you can be successful when you start looking for jobs in InfoSec and aviation. Prior to joining one, I had a hard time picturing the complexity and scale of operations within an airline. So there's countless interconnected systems, databases storing critical information, including our guests' information, as well as reliance on advanced technologies for navigation and communication. Airlines are a huge target for malicious cyber attacks. So cybersecurity obviously acts as a crucial defense mechanism that mitigates these risks. And then the need for highly skilled security professionals within the aviation sector then has never been more pressing. I think cybersecurity is a great field to get into right now. It's a growth area for most companies. And despite a lot of the other large tech layoffs that we're seeing in the news, we haven't seen any of that within cyber. And when I talk with recruiters, they all say that cyber folks continue to be in high demand. I'm hiring 2 positions right now, and it's been a very competitive market. Can you advance the slide? So the high-level agenda for the session is to go over the structure of how cybersecurity works at WestJet, and then specifically what my team, the GRC team, does within that. Then we're going to talk about how we evaluate risk at an airline and some of the challenges there. I'll go over some of the unique challenges we have with privacy law. We'll talk about the human factor in security. And last, I'll go over some of the things I've picked up as a hiring manager to hopefully give you some help in your next interview. Can you advance the slide? So I'm Aaron Ferguson. I'm the Senior Manager of Governance, Risk, and Compliance at WestJet. I've been at WestJet for a little over 5 years now. I joined in 2018 to lead the development of the Information Governance Program. That expanded into development of the Privacy Program, and then in 2019, I took over leadership of the GRC team. Also presenting with me today is Alex Mabbott.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alex Mabbott, and I am a Senior Advisor on Aaron's GRC team. I've got an academic background in physical defense and security, but I've been working in cybersecurity since 2016. The last 18 months of those have been with WestJet as part of Aaron's team, and I've mostly been focusing on our payment card industry, or PCI, compliance activities. Over to you, Alice.
Thanks. I'm Alice. I've been at WestJet for 3 years as an analyst. I oversee the cybersecurity awareness initiatives, and this includes communication, training, and phishing campaigns. My background is in business analysis, technical writing, business development, teaching, art, and film. Over to you, Dan.
Hi, everybody. My name is Neal. I'm also a senior advisor with Aaron's Governance, Risk, and Compliance team. I'm a longtime WestJetter since 1998. I have approximately 35 years IT experience. I've held both technical and leadership positions here at WestJet over a variety of domains and in cybersecurity for the last 14 or so years. Currently, I focus on cybersecurity risk management, privacy, and process development in those areas.
And we feel very lucky to have each of these folks on our team. Alice, would you be able to advance the slide? So what I have up here are the 6 different departments that comprise cybersecurity overall. In total, there's about 50 staff reporting to managers like myself, and we all report to the CISO, our Chief InfoSec Officer. The GRC department on the top left there is responsible for the creation and maintenance of our policies and standards, as well as the evaluation of information security risk. We also do all of our coordination with internal and external audit, as well as any compliance tasks that need to be done within WestJet. Next is the security architecture department. So these guys are accountable for defining the strategy and roadmap for security at WestJet. They also design our secure architecture patterns, and they evaluate the security architecture of IT projects and look at new platforms and services and decide what we want to purchase. Our security engineering department, next on that, are responsible for the support and design of our security technologies. So these are our platforms and services that we use specifically within security, like our Palo Alto, Proofpoint, and many others. On the bottom left, we've got our security operations folks. So these are the guys that monitor everything coming and going from WestJet, managing any malicious or suspicious traffic and running our incident response, our security investigations, cybersecurity exercises, as well as threat hunting and threat intelligence. They also handle requests like when we have staff who travel to North Korea and ask us, can I log in and bid on my vacation allotments? These guys will tell you whether or not you can do that. We have our identity and access management department who make sure that when we have accounts and access to systems, applications, or data resources by WestJetters or contractors working for WestJet, that's being managed appropriately. And then our privileged access management department, they're the guys that ensure that whenever we have elevated access or privileged accounts, we've got higher levels of controls deployed for sensitive access. At the bottom, the security department collaborates with a pile of people across the IT, as well as the operations organization in general, to ensure that security is getting built into everything that we do. Can you advance the slide, Alice? So this is my team specifically. The governance, risk, and compliance team has the overall accountability for providing WestJet with the framework for achieving regulatory compliance within IT and helping WestJet leaders understand and manage information security risks. So we're the fun police. We make sure that all the tedious things like laws are being understood and followed by the IT teams, and we're providing support to departments internally, like internal audit and the legal team. There's currently 7 people on the team, full-time employees on the team, including myself, and I'm hiring 2 more positions. And I also have support from anywhere between 1 and 4 part-time staff who help with special projects or admin support. I have plans to expand the team to around 12 people in the next couple of years because there's a lot of domains that I want to put more attention on. Each of the people in my department has a specific domain of GRC that is their focus and that they spend the majority of their time on. However, everybody does a little bit of cross-training in order to support each other when we've either got high workloads in one area, or people want to take vacations, or they want to job shadow and learn new things. So a day on in the life on my team depends a lot on what your specific domain looks like. So everybody on the team, though, is working with stakeholders across the organization, inside IT and outside in the corporate and operations groups, where they're all doing some flavor of analysis. They're gathering information, they're writing reports and summaries about their assessments, and then they're helping those various stakeholders remediate whatever issues we find. We also write a lot of documents, including policies, standards, guidance material, sometimes procedures, sometimes white papers on issues and threats, and that's fun. So compliance. WestJet has a lot of regulations that we need to adhere to, in addition to the requirements of our operations that are mandated by Transport Canada, who regulates airlines as a whole. We also coordinate the auditors that come in externally or internally with the various product and control owners within IT to make sure that we're gathering evidence and that the people who are providing it are able to explain how this meets whatever the requirement is. We also perform an annual cybersecurity maturity assessment where we track our progress and growth as an organization year over year. I'm also happy to say we're always moving in the right direction there. Risk management. So this is about the identifications of risks in the way we build and operate IT systems, and Alex is actually going to go into a lot more detail on that. Data classification and discovery. So this is important because in order for cybersecurity to know what we should be protecting, we need to know what the data is. So we look at what the data security sensitivity is, what parts of our data constitute personal information or PII about WestJetters and our guests. We also look at what parts of our data are the records that need to be retained and relied upon as a source of truth. And this helps support our data loss prevention programs and helps identify key systems where we're going to require additional protection. Privacy. So similar to our risk management work, we evaluate systems and processes that manage PII to ensure that the requirements of privacy regulations are being met. And then cybersecurity awareness. So improving cybersecurity's visibility across WestJet through awareness and training, because security is a big job, and the common factor in the majority of breaches is the human element. So we want everybody at WestJet to be aware of their impact on security and give them the tools they need to be successful. And Alice is going to go into a bit more about this and how our phishing campaigns function. Can you advance the slide, Alice? So on this slide are a few of the key regulations that WestJet has to adhere to that impact our IT department. The first 4 are privacy regulations for Canada, the US, and the EU, where we operate. Broadly, these requirements ensure that we're managing our employees and guest PII in a safe and responsible manner. Failure to adhere to these regulations carry heavy penalties. Fines from the GDPR specifically start at $20 million or 4% of gross revenue, whichever one is greater. CARS and IATA, so the Canadian Aviation Regulations and IATA, these are regulations that apply to airlines specifically and cover a broad range of topics, though largely looking at the safety impacting aspects of running an airline, but that also includes cyber safety. Then we've got SOX and CSOX. So these are the requirements for publicly traded companies to have financial controls in place. We aren't currently publicly traded, but if we ever went public again, we would need to demonstrate that we have robust financial controls in order to make an IPO. And some of the financial controls include IT controls. I am just going to ask that if anybody is listening and not talking, if they could mute their mic. I'm just getting some feedback from folks. All right, we've also got PCI DSS. So this is currently the biggest external audit that the IT department faces, and we're currently going through this year's audit right now. So as a company that transacts more than $50 million a year, the PCI Council deems us a level 1 merchant, and we have to adhere to the strictest requirements in protecting our credit card data. If we don't pass our PCI audit and get our report on compliance, the credit card companies, we call them acquirers, can fine us or even take away our ability to process credit cards, which, as you can imagine, would be a huge problem. We have approximately 600 flights a day and anywhere between 160 to 250-ish guests on a flight, so it's a lot of transactions. Next on the list, cybersecurity frameworks aren't a regulation per se, but they provide the outline on how we construct our security program and then the requirements and controls that we have internally as an organization and for protecting information. And then last but not least, WestJet has to adhere to over 1,200 different acts and regulations that tell us how long we have to retain company records. So each of these domains is constantly evolving, and one of the roles of my team is to stay current on them so that we can update our policies, our standards, our guides, and ensure that we continue to let the rest of WestJet know how to be compliant. Can you advance the slide, Alice? So on this slide, we have a few of the reasons why all of this focus on security compliance matters. There's a few of the higher profile penalties that companies have faced for non-compliance over the last few years. I actually think British Airways had another breach recently, but I didn't read into that. The asterisk you'll notice on the British Airways fine is actually because of the fine reduction. So that was the initial fine that they faced for this particular breach, but I believe the final figure that they were fined was about $20 million. And the reason for that was in the investigation, the regulator found that they actually did have a robust security, information security program, as well as a privacy compliance program, and really that the breach was not down to negligence. So this just demonstrates the value of having a robust security program in place. So every time we face a breach or we fail an audit, we run the risks of these kinds of fines. More than that, we also run the risk of brand damage as our guests lose confidence in us. So some of you might have heard last year that we were in the news for a data breach, so even we aren't immune to this kind of thing. I do want to call attention down to the massive increase on cyber insurance rates. This one doesn't hit the news much, but internally, we've actually seen a huge increase in premiums for cybersecurity insurance. If you guys aren't familiar, a few years ago, insurance companies started getting into this space, offering cybersecurity insurance and offering coverage over breaches, ransomware events, outages, et cetera. But because the space was so new, they didn't really know how to value their premiums. And then we saw a massive increase, an exponential increase actually in ransomware events, which saw a lot of these companies paying out more than they were receiving in premiums and essentially going out of business in this space. The people who are left are starting to value their premiums correctly, which has caused us a lot of heartache. And last, we have items like Log4j. This was a huge operations issue caused by a security incident. We ended up not actually having any issues related to it, but we ended up spending a ton of hours figuring out all of our various supply chain risks that might have been impacted by Log4j. Can you advance the slide, Alice? So these are some of I wanted to talk about some of the trends that affect security and compliance within the industry. One of the big ones that we're seeing lately, and maybe you're seeing as customers, is biometrics. So there's a big increase in technology aimed at speeding up airport screening times that focus on using passenger biometric details instead of documentation reviews. So this area has a lot of potential for big improvements in passenger satisfaction and speeding up our on-time performance of the airline, but it's at the risk of increased scope for PII data breaches. We're also seeing a lot of changing the location and scope of services. So most companies are looking at moving services to SaaS, PaaS, IaaS, but it changes or adds complexity to how we protect our information assets. Another big change we went through, and a lot of other companies, including it seems like Concordia also did, was the move to fully remote work for a lot of corporate functions. So this is, for us, it's anybody who's not at the airports or in an aircraft, and we really had to scramble to figure out what our game plan was. The next one is kind of interesting. So legacy technology and shared services. You guys might not be aware of this, but there's a YouTube channel called Wendover Productions that does mostly videos on how aviation works. They recently did one on how much legacy technology there is in the aviation space. And this is a big deal for an airline because even if everything we do is cutting edge, we're still forced to use shared services that might be really old when we work with airports, airport services like ground crew, baggage handling, or common use equipment like the kiosks that you use at the airport. I highly recommend you guys go and take a look at that channel. There's also just been industry travel trends and turbulence related to that. So the last few years have really added a lot of complexity to the industry because we wound down our services really rapidly due to the pandemic. And now we have to scale back up really rapidly. So the travel demand never went away. We're always playing catch up these days. And this is causing us issues because we often have departments who are seeking approval to, for example, use managed services in lieu of staff. You know, if we don't have enough staff to meet capacity requirements. So then our security team ends up scrambling to figure out, okay, do we have the right security controls at, let's say, a call center outside of Canada? There's also been a lot of threats affecting security and compliance. Like I've mentioned, ransomware has been huge. We've seen an exponential increase in the last few years with the average cost of ransomware incidents rising dramatically. I don't have the figures in front of me, but I remember a few years ago, average cost for a company our size was about $250,000 per incident. Now it's up over $1 million. We've also been seeing the rise of business email compromise, which I don't need to explain to you guys. This one isn't the majority of the attacks that we are seeing coming in through our threat intel, but it is increasing month over month. One of the things I find interesting about business email compromise is that we often aren't aware that it happened until afterwards when we go and reconcile the finances. This kind of attack is sort of a new spin on an old grift. I used to do oil spill incident response, and we had companies who would come out and perform work that didn't need to be performed, and then they'd bill us for it. And we called them spillionaires. And I've seen this kind of thing in different sorts of industries, and now it's just moving into the future. There's also been a greater focus on security. So like I said, insurance, a lot of companies that we do business with are requiring that we have coverage in the event of a cyber incident in our insurance policy, but obviously there's fewer insurance companies offering things, and the cost of insurance is rising dramatically. The underwriters are very rigorous these days about what kinds of controls you have in place and do you have the evidence to support it. Secondly, we've been seeing an increase in audits, so aviation-specific audits. Traditionally, the auditors who work on aviation-specific things are focused on the operation and mechanical safety, but in the last few years, they've expanded to include cybersecurity because of the recognition of cybersecurity as a driver for safety, which is good. I will also say for the curious, our flight control systems in an aircraft are completely air-gapped from other things like in-flight entertainment and whatnot. That's a question I get all the time. Don't worry about it. One of the ways that our department supports the airline in dealing with all of these things is through risk management, which now Alex is going to elaborate on.
Thank you, Aaron. So I'm sure all of you are aware of the concepts of risk awareness and risk avoidance, but as a quick reminder, I'm just going to put forward some textbook-like definitions. Risk awareness is an understanding of the potential costs and benefits of a course of action. You weigh the costs and the benefits and choose a course of action, preparing for what lies ahead. Risk aversion, on the other hand, is a generalized state in which you avoid risks. This can be from the stance of having zero tolerance for any risk, and thus you avoid all risks, even those that you know little about. Or in a more refined organization, risk avoidance can be done for risks above a certain threshold, making a decision once you're more aware of the costs and benefits of the risk and choosing the course of action that has less downside. Risk management in airline with respect to cybersecurity, far more of a balancing act than a textbook could ever explain. At WestJet, we have to balance our number one priority, which is safety above all, with our business of flying you wherever you love to go. So you need to be able to understand the needs and drivers of the business from a GRC perspective against the potential consequences of those actions. Currently, WestJet has 129 aircraft. The last thing the business wants to do is have those aircraft parked, never flying our wonderful passengers in the sky. However, that would be the only possible way to truly avoid any flight risk, by not flying them. We'd quickly go out of business if that was our mantra. From a cybersecurity lens, there are many ways that IT can introduce and reduce risk at an airline. And on the next slide, I'm going to give a quick summary on the risk assessments that we do at WestJet. So these are the four main ways that we learn about cybersecurity risk at WestJet, and I'm just going to go through them right now. First off is assessments on new internal projects and business initiatives. The business is always looking for new and novel ways to improve our product for our guests. Those initiatives and projects that have an IT element, we make sure they go through a rigorous process to ensure that the cybersecurity teams that Aaron walked you through have reviewed them to ensure that the business has considered all appropriate controls. Us at GRC will conduct a risk assessment, typically taking into account the drivers of the business in combination with any work that the security architecture has done to review how they plan and configure this new initiative. If you've flown with us recently, examples of assessments that have gone through a cyber assessment include new methods to provide guests who have been disrupted by delays with virtual credit cards to make sure that you have the money that you are due to spend while you're killing time at the airport or overnight. Another one is a full review of our new cargo business, how the various systems which must be integrated are connected and ensuring that we're not putting any shippers' data in places that it shouldn't be. Some of the larger, more complex projects also require a penetration test and ensuring that the findings from those penetration tests are taken forward and captured so that they are treated in methods that I will go through a little bit later. Then we have vendor assessments on new partners. As Aaron's already alluded to, as an airline, we have many, many vendors, ranging from those responsible to collecting and putting the bags on a plane, all the way through to cloud service providers, which help us maintain our infrastructure. All new vendors are vetted ahead of being onboarded and being operationalized at WestJet. This can involve a vendor completing a security questionnaire and providing us any additional information that supports their claims, such as SOC 2 Type 2 reports, security policies, all those kind of good things. We also leverage third-party tools that specialize in vendor monitoring and ensure that once a vendor is on board, not just when we are looking to work with them, we are keeping an eye on their posture and making sure that we are fully up to date with any ongoings with regards to our partners. We've done vendor assessments on some of the largest cloud service providers you can think of to tiny startup organizations you probably haven't heard of, and all the way through that. Next up is compliance and monitoring activities. This is where Aaron says we are the fun police. One of the largest compliance WestJet undertakes annually is the one that I lead, which is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, or PCI DSS annual audit. And Aaron's already gone into the details of why we need to go through this. Other regulatory compliance activities are required, and as I already alluded to, these are getting more of a focus with a cybersecurity focus from these, but PCI remains one of our biggest. Some of the PCI controls you may or may not be aware include performing vulnerability management activities on a regular cadence so that we can provide evidence to our auditors and the card brands and our acquirer banks that we are capable of producing clean scans every quarter. There are obviously occasions whereby vulnerabilities can't be fixed so quickly, or there might even not be a fix. And so that's when risk assessments are performed to understand what impacts, what the likelihood is, what are the compensating controls we have in place to mitigate the risk associated with that vulnerability. We're also required to do an annual penetration test for our PCI environment, as well as an overall risk assessment of our PCI environment, both of which can lead to risks being identified and managed throughout their lifecycle. Finally, the last one that I want to touch on is reporting and word of mouth. You're going to hear from my colleague Alice very shortly about the need for security and awareness. And Alice has done a wonderful job at WestJet, and this is actually something that we're very good at in terms of informing the business about cybersecurity awareness. As a result, we'll often have employees from all over the business reaching out with concerns they may have from an IT perspective and letting us know when they see potential risks or where they might think that we should be alerted about something. Common example is when we have employees reaching out saying that they've been the target of a spear phishing campaign, or they've been informed by a loved one that there's a malicious WestJet website trying to scam users out of their IDs, or worse, their credit card details, their WestJet dollars, anything like that. We take all of this information on board and work with our colleagues in the other cybersecurity departments to make sure that any existing risks are managed throughout their existence. Those are the most common ways that we learn about cybersecurity risks. And we take the time to go away and research what's happening in each case in order to get a clear picture about what the impact of the risk is, what the likelihood of the risk is, and then what we should do. Once we've got a good idea on that, we then go to the risk treatment. Next slide, please, Alice. So the last slide that I'm going to talk about is around the documentation and communication of risks. Again, you'll all have an idea of that once a risk has been identified, there are a few options on what to do with it. Typical cybersecurity responses are avoidance, so eliminate the threat altogether, like I gave earlier, the example grounding planes. Mitigate, you reduce the possibility of the impact or the threat, impact or the likelihood of the threat. Transfer, shifting the responsibility to a third party or potentially to an insurance party. Or acceptance, acknowledging and tolerating the level of risk as is. But something I want to make clear is it's not governance, risk and compliance role to make the final decision on how to manage cybersecurity risk. It's the business. Big part of our role is working with and communicating the inherent and the residual risk to members of business who may not be technical, may not have a technical background, or may not have an understanding or a background in the risk that has been identified. If a business unit is not able to grasp the severity of a risk, something that may not be acceptable to us in cybersecurity may be acceptable to the business. So that's where we provide recommendations, but also explain that any course of action that's chosen, the business is ultimately responsible for the management of that risk throughout its life cycle, as well as the consequences of any realized risk that occurs. I'm just going to finish up by giving a couple of recent examples of where we work with a business and end up having some typical cybersecurity risk treatment responses. So avoidance, first of all. Recently, a project was stopped when a vendor was unable to provide us with a level of assurance that we required. We worked with the vendor and nothing was forthcoming. And eventually a decision was made saying, no, we cannot go ahead with this. We're just not comfortable with the level of risk. The business ultimately made that decision with guidance from us. Acceptance. Not going to spend too much time here, as Aaron has already alluded to the example that I was going to give. We rely on airports to get passengers to where they want to go to. And airports are often responsible for the IT infrastructure at these airlines. Some of them may be very old, archaic legacy items, and we don't get to determine how often or how frequently the airports are updating this. And we just have to accept that if we want to fly to a certain area and that's what they've got, that's the decision that we have to be comfortable with. Finally, transfer. Shifting the responsibility onto a third party. Leverage this for a lot of our payment card industry processes. So we look to work with vendors who are PCI DSS compliant and therefore look to reduce the scope that WestJet's actually on the hook for and pass that on to them. As Aaron's already said, though, the trend with cybersecurity insurance seems to be going up and up and up. So transferring risk is becoming less of a viable option now, because the cost of it no longer reduces the level of effort or level of cost to the business and doesn't actually necessarily help us. It might end up costing us more. That's it from me. I think I'm handing it back to Aaron now to talk about privacy.
All right, so privacy is an interesting topic. It's something that gets a lot of airtime these days, which is good, but I've actually been working on privacy-related things for most of my professional career. When I worked at the federal government, one of the things my team did was process access to information and privacy requests. Back then, it was a really infrequent thing, and the people involved typically did it off the side of their desks. Privacy was largely the domain of the government, and there wasn't a lot of focus on private companies. We see people talking about it in the news these days, but people actually did start talking about privacy rights over about 100 years ago in response to the idea of publishing photographs in newspapers. These days, people still get really riled up when new technology comes into play that they feel is infringing on their privacy. I do also want to point out on the bottom right there, Canada was actually at the forefront of developing certain privacy principles that are the model for how a lot of these laws are crafted worldwide these days, with Anne Cavokian's Privacy by Design framework. And that's actually the framework that WestJet used to build its privacy requirements for IT. I joined WestJet just prior to GDPR coming into enforce. And the neat thing about GDPR is that it was some of the first privacy regulation that actually had any teeth, which is what caused a lot of companies like us who operate in the EU to really take notice. Alice, can you advance the slide? So this slide is an excerpt of the data protection principles out of the GDPR, but these principles are broadly similar across other regulations like PIPEDA and Japan's new privacy regulations, et cetera. One thing I do want to impart for the folks on this call is the difference between privacy and security. There's a lot of confusion here from security people usually. And while security is a key component of privacy, all of these other principles need to be satisfied. We need to ensure that not only are we protecting the data, but that we need to ensure we're allowed to process it in the first place, that we don't use it for any other purposes, that we don't have the right legal basis for, and that we limit the amount of data we collect and how long we hold on to it. One of the big complications in running a privacy program is often the difference between what a lawyer or a regulator thinks needs to be done versus what we in IT actually have to do. As an example, the regs say that we need to provide access to a person's data when they ask us about it. Great, right? When we actually sat down internally with our business analysts and developers to figure out what that would mean at a technical level for us, we discovered that in our enterprise data warehouse, we had close to 1,000 different permutations of how various PII data elements could be expressed. So like, for example, name could be 2 different columns, name could be all capitals and all lowercase or whatever. Every time we need to run a query on our systems, we need to make sure that we're reaching all of these various different permutations. Every time we add a new system into the environment, we need to make sure that it's integrated into our access and deletion processes. So there's a lot of complication at a technical level when you take a law and try and make it into reality. Can you advance the slide? So here's a few of the challenges we're facing in the airline industry. The first point means that we often end up having to create custom or manual solutions to resolve various privacy controls. The second and third points mean that we need to ensure that we have processes and contracts in place that support what we need to do, like providing access to information across all of these various jurisdictions. And then the fourth point means that sometimes we have contradictory legal requirements. And so we end up spending a lot of time debating internally to figure out what exactly we're going to do, what takes precedence. But when I think of the ways that working with privacy law at an airline is difficult, it's often the ambiguity of the legal basis for processing certain types of data. So there's a number of reasonable legal bases, and the most commonly understood being consent. But at an airline, the majority of the data we collect is actually collected for 2 other purposes. So regulatory requirements and then performance of the contract. So actually, what are we selling somebody? Per Transport Canada, the federal aviation regulator, and other federal aviation regulators around the world that we fly into, we need to know who's on the plane. We also need to know something about our passengers in order to sell them tickets and get bums and seats and fly them someplace and make sure their bags also get to the same spot. We need to process the financial transactions. So at a minimum, we're going to have a lot of records about these folks for a while. Additionally, we process some PII for what's called legitimate interest. And so this is where it benefits both parties to some degree. Think about call centers. We use the recordings of a call center sometimes to train our staff and make the experience of using the call center better for the passenger, but also to improve our call response times. We also process a lot of data that's optional and gathered under consent. So think our loyalty programs. But then when we have to process a right to be forgotten or a data deletion request, we need to consider not only what do we know about you, but also what are all these competing regulations or legal precedences, and what takes precedence overall when it comes to retaining that data. Can you advance the slide, Alice? So here's some of the ways that WestJet protects our guest privacy. First, we've got a chief privacy officer. So this is the person who's accountable for setting the mandate for how WestJet adheres to privacy regulation, and the person ultimately responsible for the program and dealing with regulators. And she's the one that gives us our marching orders. We maintain sets of ethical standards for protection of privacy. So we've implemented standards, frameworks, processes throughout the organization to ensure that the way we communicate with the guests and the way we design and operate our company are private by design. We maintain a public-facing privacy policy outlining how and why we use personal data, and then the ways our guests can interact with the privacy team. Conducting data protection impact assessments is the bulk of the work my team does in this space. Whenever there's a new system or process that collects, processes, or stores PII, we evaluate it, identify any risks, and then provide remediation plans. We leverage technology wherever we can to help us process requests, catalog data, manage consents, etc. And then education and training. We want to ensure that all the people who handle PII at the company are aware of their obligations in doing so. And that's a segue over to Alice, who's going to talk about security and awareness overall. We cannot hear you, Alice. I'm sure it's lovely, whatever you're saying.
Alice, still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there we go.
Yay. Okay. So thanks, Aaron. Humans play a vital role in the cybersecurity landscape. Our decisions, actions, and even the smallest mistakes in our digital world, as you know, can have profound consequences. We call this the human risk. Aviation faces most of the same challenges as other organizations in the cybersecurity awareness space. Cyber criminals use many psychological tactics in their social engineering attacks, for example. They capitalize on the fact that unique, secure passwords are hard for people to remember. So they know that we reuse, share, and create simple passwords. They are counting on our ability to make mistakes and take shortcuts. If we think about the commonly used phrase, to err is human, we acknowledge and accept a common aspect of our nature. Humans make mistakes. Cyber criminals are exploiting that every day. 85% of breaches tie back to us, the humans behind the screens. Simple oversights, mistakes in judgment, or just a lack of understanding around the technology we use can lead to a breach. So let's think about the cyber criminal for a moment. What's easier and more cost-effective for them? To convince a person into giving them access to information, or to try and outsmart excuse me, a complex security system? People are actually easier to trick and cheaper. The alarming rise of phishing sites over the last 5 years reflects this. Despite our advances and heavy investment in the cybersecurity technologies, we must realize that the core of our vulnerabilities lies not in the technology, but within us, the people using and managing these systems. That's our challenge in security awareness, to tackle the human risk. It's the current battleground of cybersecurity. So how do we get people to care about this and how it affects them? After all, we can't use the same tactics that we use on machines, on people. So to be effective in tackling the human risk, we must begin with understanding human behavior. Marketing companies, politicians, and cyber criminals all have one important thing in common. They know how to use psychological tactics and behavioral patterns to give them what they want. We should be doing the same. Cyber-psychology and cyber behavioral analytics are emerging fields that investigate how technology impacts how people think and behave. By making desired cyber-safe actions more convenient, attractive, and socially acceptable, we can influence users to adopt secure practices more easily. This has been proven to be more effective than negative and fear-based strategies, such as job-impacting penalties for falling for a phish. Even if we're well versed in spotting phishing attempts, the perfect combinations of, say, an enticing topic, impeccable timing, a good deal, or a sense of urgency can actually fool anyone, regardless of their level of caution. So there's a shift in how we do cybersecurity awareness. We're switching from going from informing the users and just phishing them randomly to incorporating our understanding of human behavior into our awareness efforts and understanding what human behaviors are most likely to be exploited. We can then create strategies that address not just the technology, but the people behind the screens. Phishing simulations are a common component in any security awareness program, but in aviation, they present some unique challenges. As communication methods have diversified, email is no longer a primary channel. This is a problem when phishing simulation platforms are mainly designed for email delivery. Our flight operations is a team of almost 10,000 people. In other words, they're the bulk of our organization. They are busy and on the move constantly. They are focused on physical safety and the guest experience. Most just don't have the time to check their work email on top of their other more urgent communications coming from other channels. Does this mean that they're safe from phishing though, since they don't check their email? No, they can still receive phishing messages in other ways or visit fraudulent websites on their devices. It just means that there isn't a way to train them effectively through the current methods available with today's phishing platforms. Most organizations assign mandatory training when somebody falls for a phish. This is another challenge for us. We can't do that without a high cost to the business due to the constraints of their union contracts. So what do we do? Cyber safety training is inserted into their annual training cycles, and it's of crucial importance because this is our primary way of making sure that they actually get the information that they need. When someone falls for a phish, because we do still phish them, we rely on just-in-time training that offers bite-sized training moments for them. We insert alerts into as many communication channels and try to encourage them to use best practices in their personal lives, such as relating to how they can protect their children or their families. The most significant impact we can make, though, is to remove the negative stigma around falling for a phish. Everyone makes mistakes. That's how we learn. We're to err is human after all. It's important to teach how to prevent mistakes whenever possible, and more importantly, to know what to do when it happens. If they know they won't be punished for a mistake, they'll be more likely to let us know if something goes wrong. For more information on the world of security awareness, I highly recommend signing up for the free annual SANS Security Awareness Summit in August. Back to you, Aaron.
So here's some of the skills that we think are important that our team uses to be successful in GRC, in addition to the technical knowledge of your domain. When I hire, I'm usually looking at a few things. I'm looking at job experience, I'm looking at credentials, but most importantly, I'm looking for attitude and behavior. It's a tough line to find in GRC. We need people who are focused on the technical, legal, and regulatory requirements. But at the end of the day, we're an airline, and my team needs to be supportive and helping the various departments who work to get our guests where they need to go. So we need people on our team who are good at finding solutions to these problems. Can you advance the slide, Alice? One of the big things that I see causing students issues when they first get out of school is expectations. And Alex kind of touched on this, but there's a difference between often there's a bit of a difference between school and work in the sense that at work, we often are forced to make the best of a bad situation. I can think of lots of examples where people who have recently come into the industry are paralyzed while doing their analysis, where they're not able to make decisions because they feel that the decisions, the options they have available to them are all going to increase or contain some element of risk. And Alex talked about this a lot, but I find I have to explain to a lot of different people, there's the risk of doing nothing often outweighs the risk of doing something imperfectly. And I find it's especially frequent with security folks because they're so used to analyzing the details of security risk that they neglect to realize that we're often just missing the forest for the trees. I've also found in my experience that when it comes to compliance, regulators put requirements in place and then we might find a non-compliance. However, Most of the time, I've found that regulators are willing to work with you as an organization, provided you're acting in good faith. So there was the example of British Airways that had their fine reduced by over 10 times because they had a robust security program in place. Similarly, we've had issues in the past at WestJet where when we spoke to the regulators, they didn't fine us as long as we had a plan to fix the issue in place. And they've been happy to work with us. We talk to these people, we talk to our auditors frequently. Everybody's happy to work with us as long as we are attempting to solve the problems. Another issue I find that people focus on is they look at their specializations a little bit too early. Often I find people want to focus on their favorite thing, but in my experience, the people who look more broadly at what kind of volunteer opportunities there are, what kinds of stretch assignments exist in the organization, tend to gain more over the course of their career. One of the other things is this exposure to other lines of business, other roles in the organization might also give you some more insight into things you like even more. But mostly it gives you just a wider lexicon of experience to draw upon when you're doing whatever your job normally is. And I find that diversity is strength on a personal level, but it's also something that I try and cultivate within my team. I make sure that the people who work on my team actually have very broad backgrounds, different experiences, that the people on the team are doing crosswork and job shadowing, because it just makes everybody, it improves the quality of everybody's insights. Salary. Another thing that people often ask is should they be focused on the job with the highest salary out of the gate? And early on, I'm going to advise you that you should be focusing more on what the role or the industry is going to teach you. And once you are a more seasoned veteran, the salary is going to follow. Continuous improvement. So I will just let you know, never stop learning and growing. Don't stop when you finish your degree. Have a continuous improvement mindset, particularly focus not just on your strengths and the things you like to do. Look at your weak points. Think about the things that you don't do particularly well, the things that you find uncomfortable, and spend some effort training and working on those things as well. Something that also that I utilized a lot when I was attempting to move into different industries or different roles is reaching out to people in the industry. Don't undervalue mentorship. Cold call people, talk to them, ask them how they got where they are, utilize this. I've used it personally, reaching out to people when I've been looking at changing jobs. And I have lots of people reach out to me and ask me for insight when they're thinking about making moves in their own career. Everyone is always happy to help out and offer this kind of thing. So make sure that you utilize that. Additionally, when you're thinking about what kinds of skills you can leverage when you're in a job interview, utilize skills that you have from outside of work specifically. I remember when I was first applying for a leadership position, I didn't actually have any direct leadership experience on the job that was paid. But what I did have was experience as a coach for a women's sports team. And I talked about those experiences and knowledge, and I found that the hiring managers were exactly as impressed with that and with that knowledge as if I'd been paid for it. And I find the same thing is true when I'm hiring now. Another example of where you can utilize skills from outside work is utilize in IT, especially home labs. Build servers, build a home lab, test things at home. One of our interns recently took a malicious payload that came into the organization, went home and stuck it in a VM and detonated it, and then wrote a little report on what was going on. And I found that fantastic. So, do as much as you can on your own time as well to practice these skills. I think it makes the quality of your analysis and recommendations that much higher when you can speak from personal experience. Another thing to focus on for learning, don't focus just on IT. Make sure that you understand the business operations, at least somewhat, especially if you're going into an interview. Learn something about the company before the interview. I always ask people when they're coming into job interviews with me, what do they think some of the trends or unique challenges are there for cybersecurity in airline? Because I think it gives a lot of insight into whether or not this person actually knows what they're about to walk into. Lastly, I will, just in the interest of time, I'll share one quick anecdote. When I'm hiring, knowledge and attitude are really important. Curiosity is super important, trainability. But I asked one time, I was hiring some students, and I had two finalists. One was a gentleman who was changing One was a gentleman who was changing fields. He'd worked in a different capacity in IBM for about 10 years. And one was a lady who was just coming out of school and had only ever worked at Starbucks. And the question that separated them, and the reason I hired the girl from Starbucks, is because I said, what have you done to improve your organization? The guy from IBM said he showed up at work every day and did exactly what he was asked to. The lady said that she had improved the sales of a particular drink, some fruity beverage, by 25% quarter over quarter. When I asked her how she did that, she said, well, I realized there was an academy around the corner and that a lot of these girls coming out of this academy would always buy this drink. So I looked up their schedule, and every time they had a big event, I would go put a sandwich board out front of their facility and just let them know these drinks were available. That's something that I think you can't necessarily teach, but I think you can cultivate in yourself. All right, with that, I know we're over time. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you so much, Dan, Alice, Alex, and Tolulope for this interesting talk. So let's take some questions. Yes, please go ahead, Kirti.
Hello, everyone. That was a great presentation. Thank you for giving us a lot of insight about how things work in WestJet. So my question is for Alice. It's about phishing. So I work in an organization where I process the phishing emails and phishing campaign tests as well. So I would like to know what would be the steps you take for particular individuals that are highly targeted every now and then in terms of phishing.
So right now, we are focused on spreading awareness in the different groups that are highly targeted. So the eventual plan, though, is to have them in a little cluster of highly targeted people that then would be phished more often. And then the plan would be to progress them through a staged campaigns where, say, like they're falling for something, that's super easy. So we would then educate them accordingly. And then once they're able to report, which is the metric that I look for, report, regularly, then they would move on to level 2 phishes, something that's a little bit harder to spot, and then level 3. So progress through different stages. Training through phishing is very effective when you have people who check email. So it is effective in our non-flight operations groups. Hopefully that answers your question sufficiently.
Alice, I'll add one thing to that.
Sure.
We also, when we're talking about highly phished groups, we also look at a top-down and bottom-up approach. So we also go and make sure that we have talks one-on-one with the leadership team and let them know that this is a concern and why, and get their buy-in before we do more of the focused work.
Absolutely. It's essential to have their buy-in.
That's great. Thank you, guys.
No problem.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Erich, please go ahead.
You're muted.
Yeah. So you are muted, Erich. So
yes, I said. Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, I said that was a great presentation from Aaron. It was very insightful. But my question goes to you. Okay, yes. So I wanted to know the difference between the information systems management and information systems assurance management, because it looks like there are two programs when it comes to your graduate studies in information studies. I wanted to know the distinction between the two, because it looks like all of these branches end up mainly into cybersecurity, risk, and compliance. Where is the diversion? Where is the difference?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. Or is the same to that?
This is a question for me, right?
Yes, there's a question for you, not Aaron. Yes, not
okay.
Aaron.
So I will meet with you later and answer this question, because I will explain to you the difference between the two programs.
Okay.
But let's now take questions related to this talk. But thank you so much for this question. I will answer it later.
Okay.
Amaka, please go ahead.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Just
Yes.
confirming that you can hear me. Okay, perfect. Thank you guys so much for the presentation. It was great meeting you and hearing from you and hearing about WestJet. I did have a question. I was just wondering, how do you guys go, or how does WestJet or the GRC team go about handling governance? And by governance, I mean the policies, the frameworks that guide you. I know you spoke a little bit about the compliance, audit readiness, and things like that. But how do you handle governance on its own? Is that a thing on its own, or is that something that goes kind of side by side with the risk assessments or the compliance?
Well, we start with governance. So our basis for our information security organization, a few years ago, we were using NIST CSF as our framework. We've recently been moving to ISO 27001. Based off of these frameworks, we build out a set of security policies that cover all the various domains of governance that we need to have in place. And then based off of those policies, we have a hierarchy of standards that are informed by the policies that have more specific requirements laid out. And then we'll work with the way the organization is structured to ensure that we have the right procedures and whatnot built into various teams. Eric, can you mute your microphone, please? Then we work with various teams to make sure that we have procedures that are meeting the requirements of those governance policies and standards. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Any other questions or comments?
I think Benoit had his hand up.
Yeah, Benoit has his hand up.
Hey, I was just curious to know if you can tell us a bit more about why you moved away from the CSF towards the ISO 27001.
We always used ISO 27001 as a reference, but the controls and the domains are broadly the same, but we found that ISO was a little bit more specific. And so when we were designing a more robust control and assurance framework, we wanted to have more specifics in that. Additionally, we found a lot of the groups that we were working with and the hires that we brought into the organization over the last few years were more familiar with ISO 27001. Dan, did you have any more specific opinions on the difference?
Not so much on the...
Oh, you're muted. You muted you.
Sorry. Yeah, one of the, not so much on the difference between the two frameworks, but one of the reasons we started gravitating towards ISO is when WestJet launched its international routes with our 787s, because the NIST is very American in its incarnation, so to speak, but the rest of the world really aligns closer to ISO. So that was one of the big drivers.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you. So last two questions. Eric, please go ahead.
I mean, I should resubmit my question to you. You said we were going to meet me later for the question.
Okay. So NG?
I would like to thank you guys from WestJet for the wonderful presentation. I just have a quick question in regards to the legacy systems. If I understand correctly, it appears as if, legacy system, because of the way they were designed and how things have moved forward, and yet they've stayed the same the way they are, and the risk landscape has also evolved. What do you do at WestJet to manage the risk associated with legacy system, considering that there's just so much you can do about changing those systems to meet the current standard?
Well, so like I was saying, a lot of these legacy systems aren't inside our control, but because of the interconnected nature of airlines as an industry, we're just forced to use technology that might be legacy when we go and work at an airport. If we want to fly into that airport, we're stuck with whatever their kiosk systems happen to be, as an example. One of the ways that we can try and manage this risk is by doing analysis that feeds into things like the selection of what kinds of programs we'll operate in. As an example, we moved to a new airport where the lounge that the airport offered wasn't going to allow us to have any control over how personal data was being managed. And so we provided that feedback through a risk assessment process to the team who was managing the lounge contracts. We said that we did not feel this was appropriate at all, but ultimately it's a business decision. We do need to provide certain sorts of guests lounge access. In the end, what they ended up doing was taking our feedback and going and finding a different airline that had a personal lounge. I forget which airline it was. That lounge and that agreement actually did meet our privacy requirements, and then we moved over to them instead. We attempt to do that kind of thing, but there's always a component of risk acceptance depending on the nature of the business drivers versus the security risk, and the decision ultimately gets left up to people above my pay grade.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much again, Aaron, Dan, Alice, Alex, and Tolulope for this interesting talk. So we will not have seminars in July or August. We will continue our seminars from September 2023. Thank you all for attending, and we wish to see you again in our next InfoSec seminar on Thursday, September 14th at 12. Enjoy your summer holidays. Thank you.
Just one reminder, please fill out the form link so that I can send you your attendance certificate if you are signing in with email that's not a Concordia email address. And thank you, Aaron, to you and your team. That was an awesome presentation.